My name is Ranger Elias Ward, and I have served in Yosemite National Park for 11 years. I'm trained in search and rescue, wildfire observation, and backcountry patrol, though none of that really prepares you for the things this place remembers. People think of the granite domes, the waterfalls, the crowded overlooks. They don't think about the quiet spaces between them, the gulches, the leftover trails, the old ranger stations from before the Park Service standardized everything. They don't think about how many names never made it out. I don't usually talk about those names either, but today everything happened fast enough that keeping quiet feels like lying. So here is the truth as I lived it, and if my wording sounds strangely formal, it's because I am forcing myself to document this in the most precise manner I can before the sun goes down and I lose my nerve. My shift started at 6:10, early enough that the valley walls were barely catching the first light. A hiker named Helena Grisham had failed to check back in after heading toward the old Tamarack Flat approach to El Capitan, a route that only appears in maps printed before 1965. Is technically closed, technically unmaintained, and officially discouraged, but you know how it goes. Some people want to beat the crowds, some want history, and some want photos no one else can replicate. Helena sent a message to her sister last night at 1942 saying she saw something strange near the tree line and would head back to her car. She never did. I was assigned primary field ranger. I took a standard day pack, my SAR radio, map, hydration, 2 emergency blankets, and a small notebook I haven't used in years. I don't know why I grabbed it. Maybe I felt the day already tightening around me, like the first hint of a coming headache. I drove as far as the service road would take me, then locked the vehicle and continued on foot. The forest was still cold enough that the air felt sharp when I breathed in. Bird activity was low, lower than it should have been for that hour, but I convinced myself the chill was the reason. I passed the old fire-scarred pines, the ones that always look like burned ribs, and continued up the abandoned path. Only 40 minutes in, I found the first sign of Helena. It wasn't her pack. It wasn't her trekking poles or her water bottle. It was a boot print, fresh, deep, and oriented downhill like she had been trying to return quickly. I crouched to examine it, brushing away a few fallen pine needles. The impression was clear. Women's size, Vibram sole, tread angled in a way that suggested urgency. But beside it, overlapping just slightly, was another print. This second one did not belong to Helena. It was larger, broader, and lacked the crisp regularity of manufactured soles. At first I thought it might be from a bear, especially considering the region, but the shape didn't match. The forefoot was too narrow, the heel too defined, and the spacing suggested a bipedal stride. Human, but not wearing boots. Barefoot, on granite, pine duff, and scattered shale. I stood there longer than I needed to. The forest around me felt heavier, as though every sound had been wrapped in felt. Even the wind seemed to resist moving the branches. When I finally straightened, my radio crackled with a burst of static, not uncommon in the folds of Yosemite terrain, followed by a single clipped word, "Stop!" I froze, lifting the handset. Bass, say again. Only static. No voice. I waited. Nothing. That wasn't one of our team. No ranger in this park would transmit a one-word command like that, not without identifying themselves, not without context. But radio interference echoes strangely here, sometimes picking up half-thoughts from other channels, so I wrote it off with effort. At 7:33, I continued up the slope. The old Tamarack route gains elevation fast, and I felt the familiar burn in my calves as the sun slowly began filtering between the trees. Around that time, I found something else that made my stomach twist. A strip of fabric, tan nylon, frayed at the edges but cleanly torn. It matched the shoulder straps of Helena's pack, according to the photo her sister provided. The problem was the height. It hung from a branch well above my head, almost 8 feet high. There is no reason for it to be up there. Not in a way that makes sense. I took the fabric down and placed it in an evidence pouch. My gloves helped steady my hands, but not my breathing. I did not like the feeling blooming at the back of my ribs, the one that reminded me of older stories passed between rangers. Warnings about disappearances near the old trails. Rumors that date back as far as 1919. Every ranger hears those stories eventually, but we treat them like we treat ghost tales. Colorful but harmless, the type kids might whisper at a fire pit. Still, there was one thing that always bothered me about the oldest accounts. The descriptions of footprints. Bare, human-shaped, too large. Always too large. I kept my pace steady. The trail narrowed and eventually gave way to an area of exposed granite. Footprints became harder to track. I stopped when I reached the outcropping known unofficially as Split Ledge, where the rock shears off into a steep drop. That's when I saw something impossible to misinterpret. On the granite surface, in a thin patch of dust, were 3 consecutive barefoot prints. Each print pointed toward the drop-off. All 3 overlapped the faint outline of a boot print. Not only had something been following Helena, it had stepped where she stepped. Precisely, as if matching her stride, as if tracking her, as if hunting her. I lowered myself to examine the impressions more carefully, my breath catching when I noticed the spacing. These weren't recent. They had been placed hours before dawn, possibly even before midnight, based on the dryness of the dust and the way the cold air had settled. Yet something about the shape looked familiar. An archival familiarity. The exact heel-to-ball ratio I had once seen in a photograph stored in a ranger office cabinet labeled, Unexplained, 1923. A sudden movement of air brushed the back of my neck. Not wind, a draft, a displacement. I stood up fast and turned. Nothing. Only the trees. Only the silence. But I knew the moment had changed the day. Knew I wasn't alone on that ridge. And knew, with a cold certainty that tightened every muscle in my body, that whatever stepped in Helena's prints had been doing it for a very, very long time. I stayed on Split Ledge longer than protocol recommends, but protocol had already started to feel like a flimsy thing, the kind of rulebook written for parks that behave the way they're supposed to. Yosemite has days when it acts like a living thing, remembering everything that ever happened in its quiet parts. Today felt like one of those days. I told myself I needed to reassess the prints, recheck the terrain, take a breath, anything to avoid admitting that I was delaying the moment I'd have to step farther up the abandoned trail. When I finally moved, each sound felt amplified. The scrape of my boots on granite, the rustle of my pack straps, the slight echo of fabric shifting. I followed the faint continuation of Helena's trail. The morning light had started to reach the upper branches, but the ground stayed shadowed in a way that felt unnatural for the hour. Even the dust on the rock seemed to hold the cold. At 8:02, I found the first sign of something that wasn't footprints. A small indentation in the duff, not a full print, but the shape of something placed gently but deliberately. The tip of a stick, broken cleanly, and positioned directly over the heel of Helena's last boot mark. It wasn't random forest debris. It was too straight, too aligned, too intentional. Like someone had marked the moment she stopped or hesitated. I radioed base again, keeping my voice steady. "This is Ward. I'm finding trace evidence. No visual on Helena. Continuing uphill. Over." Static returned, then a faint reply. "Copy. Ward, watch. Elevation." The words hiccuped, fractured by interference, but the tone was wrong. That wasn't our dispatcher's cadence. Too flat, too quiet even under distortion. I tried again, but the signal dissolved completely. I clipped the radio back to my shoulder, reminding myself that terrain around the western face often kills transmissions. I proceeded up the route until the old switchback lines began re-emerging. Faint, overgrown, but visible to someone with ranger training. That was when the forest changed. A silence settled over everything, thick as a weather front. It wasn't just the quiet of morning. This was the kind that happens when animals disappear. Deer, birds, even insects. I couldn't hear a single fly, and in early summer at this elevation you always hear flies. At 8:19 a glint caught my eye, something metallic wedged between two boulders. My first thought was that it belonged to Helena. When I reached it I realized it was older, much older. A brass button, green with age and corrosion, stamped with a design that used to appear on ranger uniforms before the 1930s. I'd seen one like it framed in the Yosemite Museum collection. This one was scratched, dirty, and still attached to a torn scrap of dark canvas. Weird, but not impossible. Yosemite's full of historical artifacts. But it wasn't the button that made my hands go cold. It was the location. The boulders formed a corridor, barely shoulder width, and the scrap had been placed directly at the entrance. Placed, not dropped. I stood perfectly still. The air smelled like cold stone and sap. Then, behind me, a crunch of duff. One step. Slow. Precise. I spun, hand instinctively going to my belt. Not for a weapon, but for the flare I always carry when visibility might become a hazard. Nothing stood there. No person, no animal. Just the forest holding its breath. But the duff had been disturbed. One fresh mark. Not a full print, just enough of a shift to indicate pressure. Toe, maybe. Bare. Human-shaped. I crouched and ran one hand lightly across the surface. The ground was still warm where something had pressed into it. That meant seconds. Whatever had stood there, whoever had stood there, had been within reach of me less than a minute ago. My heartbeat stuttered, and for the first time in years of backcountry work, I felt the primitive edge of fear creep up my spine. I didn't like how quiet I had to be to hear if something was breathing behind the trees. My instincts began tightening into one thought. Helena wasn't just missing. She was being tracked. She had been tracked all night. At 8:31, the trail widened briefly, giving me a vantage over the next ridge. That's where I spotted the first major piece of evidence, her pack. It leaned neatly against an old cedar stump, straps unbuckled, pockets zipped. Nothing spilled, nothing ripped, just set down with gentle intention. That was wrong. People in distress don't set things down neatly. Predators don't either. I approached carefully, scanning the surrounding woods. The cedar hung still, branches unmoving, yet I kept thinking of the air displacement I felt earlier on the ledge. The pack contained Helena's water, her extra socks, her map, and one energy bar. Everything accounted for, except her phone. That was still missing. Then a shadow swept across the duff. I jerked upward, heart hammering. A raven was circling overhead. One bird, big, healthy, gliding low enough to skim the treetops. Normally I would feel relief. Birds mean the forest is normal, alive. But the raven flew in a perfect circle over a single point, again and again, same radius, same arc. As if marking something. My gaze followed the arc until I saw what the bird was circling. A figure, far up the ridge, unmoving, alone. At first it looked like someone standing behind a fallen log, half obscured by distance and branches. But as I adjusted my position, as the morning haze shifted, the shape resolved just enough for my breath to lock in my chest. It was a man, tall. Too tall to be standard height, at least 6'5", maybe more. Broad shoulders, bare arms, bare legs, no pack, no gear, just standing, watching. I froze. He didn't move. Not a sway, not a shift. Not even the micro adjustments humans unconsciously make when balancing on uneven terrain. He stood like a tree or a post hammered into the ground. I brought my binoculars up slowly. My fingers trembled just enough to blur the view. I steadied them, inhaling once, then looked through the lenses. The ridge was empty. He was gone. Not walking away, not ducking, simply not there anymore. My throat went dry. The raven stopped circling at that same moment, banking hard and disappearing into the deeper forest. I lowered the binoculars and realized something I should have noticed earlier. The pack wasn't set down facing the trail. It was facing the ridge, facing the place that figure had stood. Helena hadn't left her pack behind to lighten her load. She had placed it there because she wanted to run, or because something made her stop. I straightened and scanned the trees, every sense sharp enough to hurt. The silence pressed inward again, as if the forest itself were listening with me, waiting for me to make a mistake. That's when I heard the smallest sound. A single, dry exhale. Not mine. Somewhere close. Too close. The exhale was so soft I almost convinced myself I imagined it. But years of backcountry work teach you what sounds belong in a forest and what don't. That breath wasn't animal. It was too controlled. Too close. I turned slowly, the way you move when you know sudden motion might trigger something watching you. My hand hovered near my flare again, though I knew it wouldn't help much if I was dealing with a person. But there was nothing. Only the cedar stump, Helena's pack, and a wall of trees dense enough to hide anything within a few steps. My heartbeat refused to settle, and the quiet held tight around me, as if waiting for me to misread the moment. I crouched beside Helena's pack and inspected the ground. The duff told a story, but not one I liked. There were boot tracks, hers, circling slightly, overlapping in confused loops. A person in distress often circles when disoriented or trying to decide which direction to run. But around those prints, almost threading between them, were faint depressions. Barefoot, heavy, toes splayed wider than normal. And every one of those prints faced inward, toward where she had stood. I whispered under my breath, "You weren't alone." The wind should have carried that whisper off. Instead, the sound just died in the air, as if swallowed. I stood and scanned the ridgeline again. No figure, no raven, nothing. At 8:42, I radioed base once more, speaking quietly, as though the trees themselves might overhear. "This is Ward. Found the subject's pack. Signs of distress. No visual on the hiker. I need SAR backup on standby, over." The radio hissed, then clicked. A man's voice came through, but it wasn't one of ours. "She's ahead." I froze. "Identify yourself." Static crackled. Then the same voice again, nearer, like the signal had jumped closer. "She's ahead. Don't fall behind." I pulled the radio from my shoulder and held it away from me, as though distance would lessen the wrongness of the sound. The voice was calm, flat, no natural rhythm of breathing. It didn't fade out with static. It simply cut off like someone lifting a needle from a record. Someone was playing with my frequency, or something was catching it in the folds of the terrain. Neither possibility made my stomach feel any better. I shut the radio off entirely. Once the device went silent, the forest grew even quieter, like it had been waiting for me to do that. I swallowed and forced myself to continue. Helena's trail moved upslope toward a cluster of granite boulders shaped like a broken jaw. Beyond them, the forest thickened into older growth, pine trunks wide enough that two people couldn't wrap their arms around one. The higher I climbed, the more I noticed that normal forest patterns were missing. No birds, no squirrels, no chatter of insects, just the crunch of my steps and a low hum hanging somewhere at the edge of perception, like a vibration through stone. At 9:03, I found the next piece of evidence. A water bottle, dented near the cap, lying beside a rock. It wasn't thrown or dropped. It was placed, again too neatly. I picked it up, turning it in my hand. The dent looked recent, like someone had clutched it too hard. When I shook it lightly, no water sloshed. Empty. Across the clearing, a thin line of scuffed dirt cut across the forest floor, as though someone had dragged the water bottle slowly before leaving it. The line ended abruptly halfway to a fallen log. Right where the scuff stopped, the duff was depressed. One bare footprint, clearer than any I'd seen so far. I crouched over it. The print was long, wider than Helena's foot by a margin that made my skin prickle. The toes dug in deep at the tips, like someone had leaned forward in anticipation. Or in a run. The weight distribution was wrong for a normal stride. Too heavy at the front, too light at the heel. Person preparing to lunge. My breath caught. They weren't just following her. They were closing in. A twig snapped 50 feet behind me. I twisted, scanning the slope. Nothing. The trees stood still. Shadows stretched thin and long. My instincts screamed that something was using the silence against me. Watching my back, waiting for me to move first. I stepped away from the footprint, forcing my breathing into a steady rhythm. The atmosphere had shifted again. Every nerve in my body felt slightly ahead of my thoughts, alert, stretched thin. I pressed forward. At 9:18, I reached a narrow slot between two boulders, barely wide enough for my shoulders. Helena's boot prints led directly into the gap. I could see the faint outline of her heel marks inside, but there were others too, deep, heavy depressions that didn't align with hers. Bare, large. Something had followed her in so closely that its prints landed almost inside hers, just slightly offset. I flicked on my flashlight and aimed it through the opening. The interior was dim, but the beam illuminated a vertical slab of granite at the far end. The first thing I saw was a smear, earth, maybe mixed with sweat or oils, dragged across the rock at shoulder height. I stepped through the gap. The space inside was colder, noticeably colder. The stone radiated it. My breath fogged faintly, which was alarming at this altitude and temperature. The floor showed signs of a struggle. Disturbed needles, a scuff mark, and what looked like a handprint smeared across dust. I whispered, "Helena!" A soft answering sound came back. A whimper. "Hi." Quick. Human. I spun toward the sound, heart slamming in my ribs. It came from behind a narrow crack between two vertical stones. Not wide enough for someone to pass through. Not even wide enough for a person to hide behind. But the sound had come from there. Clear. Distinct. "Helena, this is Ranger Ward. Are you injured?" My voice was steady, but my hands weren't. Another sound. Softer. Quieter. Like someone exhaling in fear. I took one step closer. Then the echo repeated. Not the sound itself, the timing. An echo shouldn't repeat like that. Not on a single exhale. But this one did, as though something had breathed out immediately after she did, overlapping her breath with its own. My stomach dropped when I realized the truth. That second breath wasn't hers. It wasn't an echo. It was a reply. I leaned in, flashlight angling toward the crack. Then something moved on the ridge outside, heavy enough to shift the light. A shadow, tall and still, standing exactly where I had crossed moments earlier. Watching, waiting, and this time it didn't disappear. The figure didn't vanish this time. It stood framed between the stones like it had been waiting for me to notice it. Even from 30 feet away, I could tell it was the same shape I'd glimpsed on the ridge earlier, far too tall, with limbs that looked a fraction too long, as if the proportions had missed some essential human calibration. The light filtering through the trees caught its skin, pale in an unhealthy way, like someone who had been underground for too long. I didn't move. My flashlight stayed angled toward the crack in the granite, but my eyes were locked on the thing at the entrance. It hadn't taken a step. It hadn't leaned forward. It just watched. And the stillness of it was more frightening than any movement could have been. Nothing alive stands that still. Very slowly, I shifted my weight, trying to maintain line of sight without provoking it. The air in the stone corridor felt cold enough to cling to the inside of my throat. I forced a breath and called out, "Helena, if you can hear me, stay calm. I'm going to get us both out of here." The moment the words left my mouth, the figure's head tilted, just a few degrees. Not curiosity, recognition, like it understood words, or tone, or intent. I didn't like that at all. I kept my body angled toward the crack where I'd heard her voice, but the longer I held still, the more I realized something was wrong with the sound itself. The whimpers hadn't repeated. I hadn't heard breathing again. The tiny noises of panic I'd assumed were hers had stopped entirely, too suddenly for someone afraid and injured. I spoke quietly. "Helena? Say something." A long silence followed, so long that my heartbeat began to pulse in my ears. Then, a soft breath answered, but it didn't sound like a woman's breath anymore. Not this time. It was lower, slower, a mimicry of human breathing rather than a person actually trying to stay quiet. My skin crawled from the inside out. I backed out of the slot, keeping the flashlight trained ahead while the figure at the entrance continued to stand in absolute stillness. It was close enough now that I could make out details. Long feet pressed into the dirt, toes splayed slightly wider than normal. Bare, filthy, the kind of filth that's layered, like he had walked these woods barefoot for years. I reached for my radio before remembering I had shut it off. With one hand, I flicked it back on, never letting my other hand drop from the flare. The radio beeped softly, and almost immediately the static filled with something else. Breathing, heavy, slow, matching the rhythm of the false breath from behind the granite crack. I swallowed. "Base, this is Ward. I have a possible visual on a subject. Request immediate backup. Repeat, immediate." The radio didn't answer with static this time. A voice whispered through it. "Closer now. Too close. You're behind." I slid down my spine. These weren't misfires. Someone or something was using my frequency exactly, responding directly, watching closely enough to match my timing. The figure at the entrance didn't move, but the voice on the radio vibrated with perfect certainty, as though whoever whispered it could see me through the trees, or through the stones, or from behind the crack. I forced myself to keep breathing, to keep thinking. Running blind in Yosemite terrain can kill you faster than any predator could. I needed elevation, a clearer path, a vantage point, somewhere I could regain radio contact. Somewhere I could stop whatever was happening from tightening around me like a snare. But first I had to get past the figure. He, if it was a he, stood just far enough away that I might be able to slip past the edge of the boulder and gain a few yards of distance. But the moment I thought about moving right, the figure turned its head slightly in that direction. Not much, but enough. It was responding to decision, not motion. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of that slot. The walls felt too narrow, the ceiling too low, the air too still. My muscles moved before my courage caught up, and I took a single step backward, deeper into the corridor. The figure stepped forward. Not a full stride, not even a step, really. More like a shift, as if gravity had leaned it closer without it lifting its feet. But the distance closed by at least 2 feet in a blink. I swallowed hard. "Don't do this." It tilted its head the other way, as if considering the meaning of the words. My pulse hammered in my throat. Then, unbidden, a new sound echoed from the crack behind me. A whisper. Not breath. A word. "Ranger." I froze. The voice wasn't Helena's. It wasn't the clipped, unnatural voice that hijacked my radio. It was male, older, strained. and eerily familiar in a way I didn't want to process. Like a voice recorded decades ago, warped with age. The figure outside the slot didn't turn toward the sound. It didn't move at all. Instead, the voice from the crack whispered again, this time with urgency. Behind you. I pivoted fast enough that my boot scraped stone. Nothing stood behind me except the granite wall and the narrow crack. But the figure outside had moved again, closing another few feet in the space of a blink. Too fast, too silent, too wrong. I realized then that the voice behind the crack hadn't been warning me about the figure outside. It had been warning me about the trail itself. Because at that exact moment, I finally noticed what I had missed earlier. Faint impressions on the stone floor behind the figure. Barefoot prints. Old, weathered, layered over time. All of them pointing into the corridor. None leading out. Everyone who had ever come through this passage had gone inward, never outward. My stomach lurched. The figure's chest expanded slowly, like someone drawing in a deep breath before stepping forward. I made my move. I flicked the flare with my thumb, igniting a sudden burst of red light that filled the corridor with violent color. The figure didn't recoil like an animal would. Instead, it stopped, still, listening. As though light wasn't what mattered, sound was. I took the chance and ran. I sprinted past the edge of the boulders, nearly tripping on the uneven duff as I cleared the choke point and bolted upslope. Branches whipped at my face, pine needles tearing at my sleeves. I didn't look back. I didn't need to, because I could hear it behind me. Not running, not crashing, just stepping, perfectly matching my rhythm. One stride behind, always one step behind. The forest blurred around me as I climbed, every muscle firing on panic and training at the same time. I didn't waste breath yelling for Helena. If she was alive, she needed silence more than noise. If she wasn't, I couldn't let myself finish the thought. Not while something paced my heels with the patience of a shadow. The flare sputtered in my hand, spitting red sparks. It wasn't meant for running. My grip kept jarring it, but I held on to it anyway. Light meant control. Light meant line of sight. Light meant things couldn't just appear out of nowhere. My boots hammered the slope, pine duff sliding under each step. Behind me, the thing kept pace without slipping on the terrain, without breathing hard, without disturbing the forest the way a human body would. Just steady steps, one for every one of mine, like it wasn't following me, like it was attached to me. I cleared the first rise and reached a narrow ridge that opened briefly to the valley. The view almost tore the breath out of me. The entire basin below looked wrong. Too still, too drained of sound. It felt like standing above a painting instead of a living forest. The flare hissed, nearing the end of its burn. I dropped to one knee, gasping, and swung it in a tight arc behind me. Nothing. The corridor of trees stretching downslope stood empty. My mind didn't relax. It tightened. The thing wasn't gone just because I couldn't see it. It had slipped out of sight before. It could stand still so perfectly you could look straight at it and not understand what you were seeing. The flare died with a final sputter. I threw the stick aside and pulled my flashlight with shaking fingers. A weaker light, but at least controllable. My radio crackled again, and for a split second I hoped for our dispatcher. Anything human, anything grounding. Instead, a voice came through, low and old and broken. Ward. My blood went cold. That wasn't Helena. That wasn't the earlier voice. This one sounded like it had traveled a long way to reach me. The words stretched thin. Don't stop. My thumb trembled against the radio button. Identify yourself. Static. A breath. Then, don't let it match you. I stared at the radio. The phrasing was wrong, the cadence wrong, the tense wrong. Not warning me the way someone alive would. It sounded like a man trying to recreate a sentence he barely remembered. And then I recognized it. It was the voice I'd heard in digitized form years ago, stored in an archive transfer from early Ranger records. A man who'd gone missing in 1934. His last transmission had been incomplete, interrupted by static, the final words broken beyond use. That same broken cadence hummed across my radio now, as if finishing itself 90 years late. I shut the radio off again, this time not out of fear, but because I finally understood something I hadn't wanted to believe. It wasn't reaching me through channels. It was repeating things it had heard, things it had collected, voices it had taken. The forest exhaled a cold draft along the ridge. My nerves jerked awake, and I pressed on. I moved north, following the faint line of an old firebreak. The terrain grew steeper, loose shale giving way to rough granite. My breath came out in short, sharp bursts. Whenever I stopped, the world held its breath with me. When I moved, the forest moved just slightly behind me. Always behind. At 9:57, I spotted something impossible. A boot. Just one. Helena's. It lay toe down in the duff, like her foot had stepped out of it mid-stride. No laces broken, no tear, just removed, cleanly, as if she had been lifted out of it. "I'm close," I whispered. The moment I said it, something answered. Not a voice, not a step, a slow slide, like a bare foot shifting across pine needles. No hurry, no concern, just repositioning, calculating. I scanned every tree trunk, every shadow. Nothing moved, but the slide unmistakably came from my left. I took one step that direction, muscles tight enough to tear, and shone my flashlight between the trunks. Two eyes reflected back at me, not animal eyes, not glowing, not shaped like orbs. These were the reflection of human eyes catching the beam. White, unblinking, too high. I stumbled back a step. The eyes didn't blink, didn't shift, didn't narrow. They just watched with a cold patience that twisted something deep in my gut. Like whatever owned them had no concept of fear, or curiosity, or pain. Then blink. Not slow, not natural, instant, like a shudder. The flashlight trembled in my grip. I forced myself another step closer. "Helena," my voice cracked. Either I was about to find her, or the eyes vanished, not receded, not moved, gone, like they had never been there. I swung the beam madly, chest tightening. The duff below where the eyes had been showed faint pressure, two long impressions where feet had been planted. Bare feet, facing me, my stomach twisted. That wasn't Helena. Behind me, a single twig snapped. I turned in a full pivot, heart pounding against bone. "Helena!" I tried again, louder, but the word felt dead the moment it left me. I couldn't shake the image of those footprints in the corridor, only going inward, never outward. I forced myself forward, following the trail of her missing boot. The ground sloped into a narrow chute where granite walls rose on both sides, funneling me downhill whether I wanted it or not. And then I heard it, a human voice, weak, breathless. "Help!" It was Helena. It had to be. I sprinted into the chute, nearly losing my footing on loose shale. Her voice echoed again, strained, desperate. "Please!" I rounded a bend so sharply my shoulder scraped the rock, and stopped dead. Helena's other boot lay in the center of the chute, fresh, still warm, and beside it, kneeling in the dirt, was a shape, human-shaped, face down, perfectly still. My breath caught. I took one step closer. The shape did not react. Another step. Still nothing. I raised my light, and the shape inhaled. Long, deep, slow. Not one gasp. Not one sign of relief. Just a slow, steady breath. Like it had been waiting. like it had been resting, like it had known I would find it. The body lifted its head and smiled. The smile froze me harder than any sudden movement could have. It wasn't wide or manic. It wasn't twisted or grotesque. It was small, almost polite, a smile someone might give when recognizing an old friend across a room. A smile without warmth, without humanity behind it. I stood perfectly still, breath caught somewhere in my chest. My flashlight beam clung to the shape like it didn't want to touch it. The figure kept kneeling, shoulders rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. Not strained, not panicked, just measured, practiced. The breath of something that had mimicked humans long enough to know the mechanics but not the feeling. The head tilted. Same smile, same cold eyes. Then it spoke. Ranger. My stomach turned to ice. The voice wasn't Helena's. It wasn't the cracking old voice from the radio. It wasn't the clipped whisper I'd heard earlier. It was my voice, perfectly reproduced. My exact tone, down to the slight rasp I get when I've spent a morning breathing cold air. It felt like listening to a recording of myself. But not from today, from some earlier time. Some moment it had stolen while I wasn't paying attention. My own voice, coming from a kneeling shape, whispered again. Ranger. I forced air through my lungs, gripping the flashlight so hard my knuckles whitened. Where is Helena? The shape blinked, another instant shutter blink, too fast, too clean. Then, slowly, painfully slowly, it raised an arm and pointed deeper into the chute. Not toward safety, toward shadow, toward a darker section where the granite walls narrowed into a throat of stone. I didn't trust it, but it hadn't lunged yet. It hadn't made a move toward me. It only knelt, breathing in that slow, ritualistic way, mimicking life without living it. And then I noticed something else. Its feet, long bare, filthy, the same splayed toes I'd followed all morning. A cold realization crawled up the back of my neck. This wasn't Helena. This was the thing that followed her. The thing that followed many before her. Before I could even take a step back, the shape inhaled deeply and slowly stood. Not like someone standing normally, shifting weight and engaging muscles. It rose straight up, like someone pulling a puppet vertically by invisible strings. My entire body tensed. When it reached its full height, the thing steadied itself, head slightly angled, as if listening to some sound behind me. Then, it stepped aside, not toward me, not away, just slightly to the left, leaving the chute open, inviting me to continue. I didn't want to go forward. Every rational instinct screamed to retreat, climb back up the slope, get distance, find a vantage point, call for SAR backup, and wait for bodies who could confirm this wasn't just some wilderness-induced hallucination. But then I heard it. A real voice. Faint. Hoarse. Human. Help! Helena. This time, unmistakably Helena. That single word cut through every instinct telling me to run. I moved forward. The kneeling figure didn't follow. It simply stood there, head slightly tilted, hands limp at its sides, watching me pass. The small smile never moved. When I edged past it, I felt a shift in the air, like stepping between two different temperatures. The flashlight beam flickered against the granite walls, revealing scratch marks along the stone. Fresh and old mixed together. Claw marks, finger marks, marks left by boots, marks left by bare feet. Too many directions, too many stories overlapping. The chute tightened into a narrow corridor, barely wider than my shoulders. The rocks pressed inward, and the air grew colder with each step. Helena, I called, voice scraping against the stone. A sob answered. Close, too close. I sped up, stumbling over loose scree. The corridor opened into a small recess, shielded from above by an overhang of granite. There, curled against the wall, arms wrapped around her knees, shaking, was Helena. Alive, breathing, eyes wide and red and terrified. She looked up when my light hit her face. For a second, she didn't believe what she saw. Then she exhaled a single, collapsing breath and whispered, "Ranger? Oh my God! Oh my God!" I knelt next to her, checking her pulse with trembling fingers. It was rapid but steady. She clung to my jacket with both hands, crushing the fabric. It followed me," she stammered. "I tried to run. I tried to hide. It knew where I was going. It knew every time I looked back. Copied me. Her body shuddered. It stepped where I stepped. Her words hit like a blow. She had seen it too. "I'm getting you out of here," I said, voice low and controlled. "Can you stand?" She nodded weakly. I helped her rise, scanning the corridor behind us. Empty, silent, but that meant nothing. Could disappear between breaths. When Helena managed to get to her feet, she whispered. It kept whispering my name. It sounded like my sister, then like me, then like someone else. It said it had been waiting. Her voice quavered. I tightened my grip on her arm. "Stay with me. Don't listen to anything that sounds like a voice." We moved now. We headed back toward the chute entrance, moving carefully but quickly. Helena limped, favoring her right leg. She kept glancing over her shoulder, breath freezing every time a pebble shifted underfoot. Where is it?" she asked. I swallowed. "Behind us," because everything in this forest was always behind. We reached the point where the chute widened again, and the figure was gone. Not a print, not a shadow, not a sound. Helena clutched my arm. "Where did it go?" she whispered. Before I could answer, something shifted above us. A soft scrape, stone on stone. We both looked up and froze. High on the granite wall, clinging to the rock like an insect, a human-shaped silhouette moved. Sideways, effortlessly, limbs too long, hands flat against stone, head turning slowly toward us. No sound, no breath, just a slow, deliberate crawl, like it had been waiting, and now it had found a better angle. The silhouette clung to the granite like its bones bent differently than ours. It moved with a slow, deliberate fluidity, no strain, no hesitation, no searching for handholds. Its limbs extended farther than human anatomy should allow. Fingertips spread wide against the rock as if the stone welcomed its grip. When its head turned fully toward us, Helena's nails dug into my arm so sharply that it snapped me into motion. "Move," I whispered. We backed down the chute as quietly as the terrain allowed. Each loose rock felt like a landmine of sound. My flashlight beam jittered, sliding across jagged stone and dead needles. But every time the light drifted up, the silhouette remained visible, crawling horizontally across the granite wall like the mountain itself was tilting for its benefit. Helena stumbled. I caught her, steadying her weight, heart hammering so loudly I was certain the thing could hear it. She tried to breathe quietly but failed, pulling thin, panicked gasps between clenched teeth. The air around us felt dense enough to choke on. I turned my beam upward again. It had stopped, not mid-crawl, not at a rest point. It hung suspended, one hand and one foot gripping the stone, body arched, head angled toward us, studying, waiting, tracking our hesitation. Then, with the slow certainty of something confident in its territory, it pressed its free hand flat to the granite and began descending. Not climbing down, descending like the wall was a floor. I forced Helena behind me and whispered, "Stay low. Follow my steps exactly." My voice felt tight in my throat, ready to crack. My lungs ached with each shallow breath. The thing moved faster now, Still silent, still controlled, but with a speed that tightened my muscles into pure instinct. I adjusted my grip on the flashlight and pulled my flare from the side of my pack, striking it hard enough that sparks shot out like fireflies. The red light burst to life, bleeding color into the stone corridor. For a moment, the creature paused again. Its head shifted, as if the flare's hiss interested it. But the hesitation lasted only a heartbeat. It resumed descending faster. The chute opened onto a downhill slope covered in old cedar needles. I guided Helena forward, half supporting her weight as we ran. My boots skidded across uneven ground, nearly throwing us both off balance. Behind us, I heard nothing, and that terrified me more than footsteps would have. Silence meant control. Silence meant confidence. Silence meant it was choosing when to close the distance. At 10:21, we reached the bottom of the slope and hit a narrow plateau with a fallen log bridging a shallow ravine. Helena's leg buckled again. She gasped and clutched my sleeve. I can't." "Yes, you can," I rasped, pulling her upright. "We don't stop here. Stay with me. You're doing good." She nodded, breath shaking, tears tracking down her dust-smudged cheeks. I put one hand on her back to steady her and guided her across the log bridge. The drop wasn't far, maybe 6 feet, but a fall would slow us long enough to erase whatever small lead we had. Halfway across, a sound finally reached us. A single, low click, like a tongue tapping the roof of a mouth. Helena froze, her shoulders rigid, her breath stopped. "Don't look," I whispered. "Just cross. Now." Another click. Closer. My blood iced. I pushed her gently forward. She staggered onto the far side just as I turned, flare raised. First, I saw nothing in the trees behind us. Then my beam caught movement, not on the ground, above it. The thing emerged from the branches, unfolding from shadows like it had been woven into them. Its body stretched downward from a height no human could have climbed to without gear. It reversed itself mid-descent, shoulders twisting, hips rotating, not like a fall, but like a creature deciding which direction to face while dropping. It landed in a crouch, silent, perfectly balanced. Too close. I flung the flare down between us. It hissed violently, sparks spitting across the duff. The creature didn't recoil as strongly as before, but it shifted, leaning just slightly away from the heat. I grabbed Helena's arm. "Run!" We bolted along the plateau, weaving between rocks and burned-out stumps. Every breath felt serrated, cutting up my throat. My legs burned with effort, but I didn't dare slow. I kept my beam angled behind us whenever terrain allowed, catching only glimpses, flashes of pale skin between trunks, the faintest impressions of bare feet striking earth without sound, a silhouette sliding parallel to us like a shadow chasing its source. It moved not forward, but sideways, always beside us, always at a matched distance, like it was herding. I realized then we weren't escaping. It was guiding us, and that thought nearly toppled me. At 10:34, the forest opened, abruptly and violently, into a clearing. Not natural, not mapped. A place where trees had fallen in patterns too organized to be storm damage. Shapes lay scattered, old packs, scraps of clothing, rusted canteens so weathered they belonged to another era. A cold shiver prickled down my spine as I recognized what this was. A dumping ground. A place where time didn't decay things at the rate it should. Helena stared, trembling. This is where it brings them." I couldn't disagree. I saw at least 3 items I recognized from missing person reports dating back decades. A torn Ranger hatband from the 1970s. A metal frame from an ancient external pack. A shredded map case. All untouched by scavengers. All preserved like offerings. I turned to get Helena out, but the forest behind us closed. Not with trees falling, not with movement, with silence, the oppressive kind that thickens the air until you feel it in your teeth. A shadow stretched across the clearing, not from sun angle, from height, from something towering at the tree line. The creature stood at the edge, not crawling, not crouched, standing, full height, arms slightly parted as though welcoming us. And then, behind us, deeper in the clearing, something else exhaled. Slow, human, old. Helena clutched my jacket and whispered, "There's more than one." My throat sealed shut, because she wasn't wrong. The exhale hadn't come from the creature watching us. It had come from behind us, from among the old packs, from the trees at our backs, from something that had been waiting until we crossed into its ground, something that had been matching us too. The exhale behind us froze both of us where we stood. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It sounded tired, like someone waking after too long a sleep. But there was no warmth in it, no humanity, just the suggestion of lungs moving in a rhythm learned from watching people breathe rather than being alive enough to need oxygen. I turned slowly, positioning myself between Helena and the sound. My flashlight beam swept across the clearing, catching the reflective sheen of old metal, faded fabric, the ghost-pale shape of a long-abandoned sleeping bag, and then something else. A figure, half concealed behind a fallen tree, one knee on the ground, head lowered, shoulders hunched, as if kneeling in prayer or collapsed from exhaustion. But the thing didn't rise and fall with breath. It only exhaled, over and over, a motion that lacked inhalation, like something performing the outward half of breathing for effect. Helena took a step back. Her sneaker brushed a tin cup lying in the dirt. The soft clink of metal on metal carried across the clearing like a firecracker. The kneeling figure's head snapped up. Not lifted, snapped. Its neck straightened with a single, clean motion, like a rope being pulled taut. I raised the flashlight. The beam shook. The figure blinked against the light. Not a natural blink, but the same instant shudder I'd seen earlier, too fast to process. Its eyes were unfocused, almost glazed, as if it didn't understand light but recognized attention. And then I realized something worse. The creature at the far edge of the clearing, the tall one that had followed us across the chute, had not moved. It stood where it had first appeared, watching quietly. But the kneeling one, it was smaller, shorter, not childlike, just worn down, shrunken, like something that had been mimicking humans for too long. Skin stretched too tight, frame too thin, a leftover. My stomach lurched. This one wasn't hunting. It was failing. I whispered to Helena without turning. "Stay behind me. Don't run." She grabbed the back of my jacket. "Ranger Ward." "What are they?" Before I could answer, the kneeling figure let out a series of clicks. Rapid, uneven, like teeth tapping together. The sound echoed against the clearing in a pattern that made no sense until I realized it was copying something familiar to it. Footsteps. It was copying footsteps. Not mine. Not Helena's. Someone else's from long ago. A signal exchanged between creatures. A warning. Or a greeting. The tall one finally moved. Not with a step. With a shift. Its weight rolled to the balls of its feet, body leaning forward like a drawn bow, every inch of it angling toward us. Not attacking, not yet, waiting for something, reacting to something the kneeling one had announced. I flicked the flare again, praying for a spark. Nothing. The fuel was spent. I tossed the dead stick aside and reached for the second flare, but before I could strike it, another sound split the clearing. A voice. A man's voice. Close. Behind the kneeling figure. It spoke with a raw, ragged breath, like vocal cords dried out by decades of disuse. "Ranger, help! Helena's fingers dug into my jacket again. Is that another hiker? I wanted to say yes. I wanted to pretend that voice belonged to someone human, someone who needed aid, someone I could reach with protocol. But the tone, the cadence, the sense that it had waited for us to be surrounded before speaking, every part of me knew the truth. It wasn't asking for help. It was practicing. A figure stepped forward from behind the fallen logs, human-shaped, but not moving like anything alive. Its joints bent too wide before snapping back into place. Its arms hung too long. Its head tilted like a bird studying a shiny object. Spoke again, same voice, same plea. "Ranger, help!" Helena whimpered. It sounds like my uncle." She choked on the words. "He went missing here in the 90s. The creature blinked with that unnatural shudder. Then it inhaled sharply, an exact imitation of a terrified gasp. I realized too late that it was copying her, using her memory, using her fear. The tall one began to step forward now, each motion smooth and horrifyingly confident. The ground didn't shift under it. Leaves didn't crunch. It moved like a projection gliding across a floor. My survival instincts kicked hard. "We move on my count," I whispered. 3, 2. A sound interrupted me. Not a click, not a breath. A voice. From my radio. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't turned it on. But it crackled to life anyway. Speaker hissing softly. A moment later, a clear, steady voice spoke through it. "Ward, don't move." My breath caught in my chest, because I knew that voice. It was Ranger Porter. Porter had been missing since 1987. The dispatch logs still recorded his last known location. Near Tamarack Flat. Near here. Helena stared at the radio with wide, horrified eyes. "Oh God! Oh God! It knows them all." The creatures reacted to the voice, subtly. All 3 of them lifted their heads, tilting toward the radio like animals hearing a familiar call. The tall one stepped closer, closing another foot of distance with terrifying calm. My mind raced. They imitated. They circled. They herded. They collected voices. But they also reacted. They paused at certain sounds. They hesitated at heat. They listened for mistakes. I didn't need to outpace them. I needed to break the pattern. "Helena," I whispered, "when I say run, don't run straight. Move diagonal. Change your rhythm. Don't let it match your steps." She nodded, eyes overflowing with terrified understanding. The tall one leaned forward. The kneeling one clicked softly. The thin one shuddered with a dry, cracking breath. My entire body tightened. "Helena!" The creatures took a step. All at once. "Run!" We sprinted. Not straight. Not in rhythm. I ran hard left. Helena cut right. Our steps staggered, irregular, messy. I forced my legs into lunges and half-steps. Anything to break the pattern. Behind us, something screamed. Not human. Not animal. A sound of frustration. A sound of lost synchronization. We'd broken the match. Helena stumbled, caught herself, and kept moving. I grabbed her wrist, pulling her across fallen trunks, weaving through the clearing in jagged lines. Behind us, the creatures scrambled. Not smoothly, not confidently. They moved erratically, like something thrown off its axis. We reached the tree-line at a full sprint, and then the world dropped out beneath us. Literally, the ground gave way. Pit, a sinkhole, a collapse long buried under duff and branches. Helena screamed as we fell into darkness, and something above us roared in rage. The fall wasn't far, maybe 8 feet, but we hit hard enough to knock the air out of both of us. Helena cried out, landing badly on her left side. I twisted mid-fall and struck the ground shoulder first, pain detonating down my ribs. A cloud of dust bloomed around us, thick as smoke. Above, the edges of the collapsed ground frayed in jagged lines of roots and pine needles. I forced myself upright, coughing. "Helena, talk to me." I'm okay," she gasped, though the tremor in her voice said otherwise. "My ankle, I think it twisted." I swept my flashlight across the pit. The space wasn't natural. The walls were too smooth, the bottom too flat, like an old root cellar or a fire shelter long forgotten. It smelled of cold dirt and iron, with a faint, metallic sweetness that tightened my throat. Above us, something moved at the edge of the collapse. A long, pale arm reached down, fingers searching the air blindly. Another hand appeared, then a head, tilted, listening, sensing. Couldn't see us. The dust. The slide had thrown up enough debris to cloud the air, hiding us from view. But it could hear. I could feel it in the careful tension of its posture, the way its fingers flexed and curled, tasting sound. "Stay still," I breathed. Helena clutched my wrist so hard it numbed my hand. More shapes gathered at the rim. 3, 4. Their silhouettes leaned over the edge like vultures circling a dying thing. They didn't speak. They didn't click. They didn't imitate. They simply listened, waiting for our next move. Helena's breath shuddered. Too loud. One of the silhouettes jerked its head toward the sound, sniffing the air like a starving dog. I covered Helena's mouth with my hand. Her tears soaked into my palm. We stayed frozen. Seconds dragged. Then movement above us shifted. A sound like scraping cloth or joints repositioning. They were leaving, not retreating, not giving up. Repositioning. I didn't like what that implied. Helena whispered against my hand. "What do we do?" "We get out before they decide how." I angled my flashlight upward. The walls weren't unclimbable, packed soil with exposed roots. But the creatures could wait above the entire perimeter. Every direction was a trap. "We go diagonal," I murmured. "They match movement. They anticipate straight lines. We don't give them one." Helena nodded, swallowing hard. We moved toward the left side where the wall was weakest. I braced my boot against a root, reached for another, testing the soil. It crumbled at the edges but held enough weight. I slung Helena's arm over my shoulders and boosted her upward, guiding her feet to footholds. Behind us, above us, that terrible clicking returned. Not random, conversational. They were signaling one another, adjusting positions, tracking. Helena stopped climbing. "Ranger, I know," I whispered. "Keep going." I climbed right behind her, one arm bracing her, the other gripping roots that felt ready to snap. The loose dirt slid under our boots. Needle debris fell into our faces. Every movement risked noise, and one sound did it. A pebble, a single pebble, broke loose from the wall and clattered down the pit. The forest above us went silent. Then, a long, low exhale drifted over the rim, brushing my skin like cold fingers. They knew. Helena's breath hitched. A shape dropped into view, not falling, descending, headfirst. Its spine arched backward as it crawled down the pit wall, fingertips sinking into dirt silently. Its face angled toward us, mouth parted slightly. Not in hunger, not in malice, but in anticipation. Helena whimpered. "Climb," I said. "Now." She scrambled upward, adrenaline pushing strength back into her legs. I climbed behind her, slipping once, catching myself on a thick root that tore nearly free. The creature reached the halfway point of the pit, its body pressed flush to the wall like a spider flattening itself against bark. It moved without breath, without noise, without effort. I shoved Helena upward with both hands. Grab the rim. She stretched, fingers hooking onto the edge. I pushed, lifting her enough for her to haul herself over. Her sneaker disappeared onto steady ground. Then something grabbed my boot. Cold fingers wrapped around the heel, pulling. Not violently, not frantically. Slowly, patiently, like reeling in a fish. I kicked hard. The fingers tightened. Soil fell in clumps around me. My flashlight slipped and smashed against the wall, beam flickering weakly, still pointed upward. The creature came into full view. His face wasn't monstrous. That was the worst part. It looked almost human, but wrong in ways that made my brain recoil. Features arranged too symmetrically. Skin too smooth in some places, too stretched in others. Eyes too reflective, as if it had studied humans for so long it now wore an approximation of one. It opened its mouth and spoke in Helena's voice. "Don't go!" My stomach lurched. I kicked again, harder. The fingers slipped just enough for me to drive my heel into its jaw. Its head snapped back, not in pain but in recalibration, like a machine resetting itself. "Elias!" Helena cried from above, reaching down. "Take my hand." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed her wrist and she pulled with everything she had left. I clawed at the dirt, boots scraping, the creature lunging upward, and I rolled onto solid ground as its fingertips brushed air inches from my face. Helena dragged me away from the rim. We tumbled backward into the ferns, gasping. The creature clawed at the edge, but the collapse had loosened the soil. Every time it tried to climb out, the earth gave way beneath it. It wasn't trapped, just delayed. And the others, they were already repositioning. We ran, not uphill, not downhill, sideways, cutting across terrain no trail ever intended for. We broke rhythm deliberately. Fast steps, slow steps, sudden pauses. Anything to prevent the creatures from sinking with us. The forest screamed with our passage. Branches snapping, stones sliding, dust rising. The creatures didn't scream. Not once. They followed in silence, their movements a ghostly mirror to ours. But the forest changed. The ground sloped. The trees thinned. And suddenly sound returned. Wind, birds, the normal hum of life. We crossed some invisible threshold, and the park came back to itself. Behind us, at the edge of that boundary, shapes gathered, silent, motionless, watching, their silhouettes stretched between the trees like stains in the light. They could not cross, or would not. I didn't wait to learn which. 3 hours later, SAR teams reached us. They never saw the creatures. They never found the pit. They found Helena's boots, her pack, the clearing where old belongings lay. But none were where we left them. The forest, they said, had no record of that location even matching historical treefall patterns. Helena and I were transported to medical. She recovered. Mostly, I returned to duty. Mostly, I still walk the trails, still answer calls, still serve the park. But at night, when the valley quiets, I hear footsteps, not approaching, not retreating, matching mine, always one step behind, always waiting for me to slip. And sometimes when the radio crackles, I hear my own voice whisper, "Don't fall behind." Because whatever has been hunting hikers in Yosemite, it hasn't stopped. It never stopped. It's been practicing for 100 years. And now, it knows my name.